We are talking about the Sigma 500mm f5.6 tiny prime telephoto, now available for Sony E-mount and the L-mount Alliance. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, and this has been a really cool lens to be testing for the last couple weeks. I paid for this with my own money. I am not getting this from Sigma. I am not clearing any of my comments with anyone. So I'm giving it to you straight, my experience, my review from a couple weeks using this lens in the field. So let's just walk through it. We're going to talk about handling, we're going to talk about build quality, sharpness, bokeh, image stabilization, as well as some thoughts about combining this with the 61 megapixel sensor on the A7RV. So how can you talk about a lens like this and not first talk about handling? I mean, that's really the whole point of a small, compact, super telephoto lens or prime. It weighs under 3 pounds. It's a joy to use. It tracks subjects, birds in flight and things like that really nicely. And it's just easy to use on a camera. It's kind of a breath of fresh air compared to the large super telephotos that I've used in the past, like the 500mm f4, which is, 7.5 pounds, like 2 feet long, and it just, I mean, the lens hood is basically the size of this whole lens. And it just gets caught on stuff. Like, it's fine for if you're in the field and you're just in the brush, but anything short of that, like in a car or just even walking around, and it feels cumbersome. But this lens just weighs nothing. I mean, it's so easy to just carry with you all day. It sits in a camera bag, like the Brevity backpack, which is a tiny backpack I just reviewed. It fit in the Brevity bag, the jumper bag, horizontally in that pack, and it was just like a 70 to 200mm f2.8 lens. And I think that's how I would think about this, is it's basically like getting a 70 to 200 that's actually a 500mm prime. So really amazing from a handling perspective, very easy to use. It has this nice aperture ring, which has like a nice, you can hear it, clickable aperture ring. I mean, functionally, I'm not sure what the value is of that. I mean, I guess if you're doing videography, being able to declick that ring and use it for like a focus pull would be kind of nice. For my purposes, I shot it, for photography at f8 or f5.6, nothing more narrow than f8 because f8's already pretty narrow. So, from my perspective, it's not necessarily that useful for me, but it is really nice to use, and the handling is really nice. It has a very nicely dampened focus ring that's very, very quiet and soft and very easy to use. And then it has a number of switches that you can use for various functions in the field. Really, I think most useful is probably the optical stabilization settings, which it has 2 settings. It has the general kind of all dimensions optical stabilization, 2 dimensions, and then it has the second setting, which you just stabilize in one direction and allows you to pan more easily. So other than that, I didn't really mess around too much because I'm going to shoot in autofocus all the time, and I typically use with these modern lenses full range of autofocus because they're so quick. But there are the function buttons here that you can use. I used one of these actually, so I set my function button here in the camera so it communicates with the Sony cameras, and I was able to use the function button to do the crop mode. So I found that really useful in the field. So I'd be shooting a subject, want to go into crop mode to get up to 750 millimeters of effective focal length, and I would just hit that button right there and I would be in crop mode. So I thought that was really neat in the field. So from a handling perspective, it was really great. It integrated really well with the Sony A7RV and just functionally really worked really well. Also from a handling perspective, that's kind of nice if you are using a tripod. This tripod ring, you can unscrew it and then it rotates all the way around. And I think that's really nice. And it has the clicking for the different 90-degree increments, which allows you to comfortably know that you're going to have a level shot. So, nice little features there. The foot is a Arca Swiss compatible foot, which is always welcome as well. The lens hood also has the screw-on design. This is something that if you've used telephotos of the past, like super primes, like 500 millimeter, 600 millimeter f4s, 300 millimeter 2.8s. You're familiar with this type of model. It's a screw that you screw in, and what it's doing is pushing in a screw with a little damper, and that's what attaches to basically a friction attachment to your lens. The Canon implementations in the past, I always was a little bit nervous about because it felt like they frayed over time and scratched. This one is interesting. It doesn't have any padding at all, but it's plastic, so I suspect it won't rub off on the lens too much. Nice lens hood, very lightweight, easily fits on the back of the lens, on the front of the lens rather, like this, and allows you to, mount it in storage and store this in your backpack in a very compact fashion. From a build quality perspective, this is very well built. It's plastic, the exterior, but it is very premium feeling and feels appropriate for the price point of around $3,000. It is lightweight, right? We already talked about, but also seems durable and well finished with a kind of exterior that is appears to be fairly scratch resistant, and is generally just a well-built Sigma sport lens. I think it's kind of where they've matured as a company to be producing something that feels completely at the same level as all the first-party lenses available, and in this case on Sony E-mount is really representing a lens option that is just not available at all on, and for L-mount, not available at all on the mount. So you see here a premium product that's well built, that handles really well in the field, and offers something of a niche that isn't currently fulfilled by the native lens lineup. So sharpness, I mean, it's got to be sharp, right? Like we got to be able to see the feather detail and the ring, feathers of a bird in order for this to be a viable option, especially at $3,000. You're looking for absolute perfect premium sharpness from a prime like this. And I can, rest assure you, if that's a saying, I can tell you that it is very, very sharp. I didn't really need additional sharpness. Now there are some caveats to that I'll get into when I talk about stabilization. But functionally, in the field, I got the level of detail I would expect out of the sharpest possible lens to fully resolve the A7R5 61 megapixel sensor. The level of detail is exceeding my expectations and extremely sharp. The feather detail, the ability to focus on the eye and see all of those detailed feathers right around the eyelet of a bird, this is going to resolve all of those features. And you're far more likely to have the effects of heat haze or motion movement and things like that to be an issue in your sharpness than you are with the optical capabilities of this lens. When it's sharp, it is as sharp as anything I've ever shot, and that includes, again, like the Canon EF 500mm f4 or the EF 300mm f2.8. The sharpness is pretty much throughout the entire frame as well. I didn't notice any issues with like fall off sharpness at the corners or anything like that. There are much more extensive and well-resourced reviews out there that you can also consult, where they're using like MTF calculations and IMMATEST, technical calculations there. These programs you pay for that you can consult and review. But from my perspective, shooting this lens, I did not want for sharpness. Bokeh. With a lens like this, f5.6, 500 millimeters, we want to see good bokeh. Now these optical elements that they're using in here are pretty similar to what we would see in, like, for example, the Nikon 500 millimeter f5.6, which is very similar to this lens that was available on f-mount. These Fresnel elements or Fresnel elements, or DO optics that Canon used. I forgot what that stands for. So, we're using these certain elements to allow them to keep the weight down, but sometimes affect bokeh, gives you specular highlights and has some potential issues in the rendering. I didn't see any issues like that, except for maybe on like one or two occasions where I had like a water droplet in the iris, on the iris or on the feathers right around the eye of a bird. So it just caught it in just the right light where it would refract some of the light and you could see something weird going on. But it was not an issue. And honestly, like, I think I've had those effects in other telephoto lenses that weren't PF or Fresnel elements or anything like that. So I'm not even sure that I'd attribute that to the lens design as much as it is just the random happenstance of the direction of light rays and how it interacts with lens elements. So, the bokeh is really, really nice. It's very creamy and very elegant. It's a personal preference, but some of these photos you're looking at, like, they're great. Like, they're creamy, they're lovely. It resolved it really nicely. The colors are really nice. The image is just a really nice image, and I don't really have any objections or anything more to note on that fact. Image stabilization. Now, image stabilization is one that I've been kind of unsure of, to be honest with you. I had read in a couple reviews and seen a couple reviews online where folks had talked about the way the image stabilization works on this lens, and that it's functioning such that you get like a sharp image followed by like a not as sharp image followed by a sharp image followed by a not as sharp image. And I definitely experienced that. There's a little bit of jerkiness to the way the image stabilization works, but I don't know if it's the image. I'll say to you, I don't know how much of this is the image stabilization, how much of it is the fact that there is a little bit of a shutter shock going on with the A7R5 because I can't shoot an electronic shutter. But it does seem like you have kind of a sharp image followed by a not sharp image followed by a sharp image. So that is a bit of an issue. And it's maybe an objection I have to the combination of this lens with the A7R5, where when you're shooting 10 frames per second, if every other image is the tack sharp image you want, you're only getting a 5 frames per second hit rate. Now that's great, right? Just because the autofocus is so good, it's able to, the camera and the lens are able to communicate so well for autofocus. It is so fast autofocusing that you're able to just guarantee basically that 5 of those 10 shots are going to be tack sharp and perfectly focused. But at the same time, based on current standards, 5 frames per second of really tack sharp focus is not necessarily that good, particularly for wildlife where you're trying to capture like a special moment in the field. So I would say there were a couple times where I experienced some annoyance with the tack sharpness of the camera, but I don't think it's sharpness of the lens. And that's why I don't put it in the sharpness section. I think it's something to do with the image stabilization. So there's enough of a little bit of movement and the image stabilization is kind of calibrating itself. The other thing is just coming from Nikon for me, it takes a little bit of getting used to that the image stabilization kicks in when the autofocus lock kicks in. So if you don't have a focus lock, it's wobbly. And even if you do have a focus lock, it's not like the best image stabilization that I've experienced. I think the Nikon stabilization is still better than what I'm seeing with the Sigma and the A7R5, which, they're both wonderful, but they're just not quite as good as what I'm seeing in the Nikon lenses. So it left a little bit to be desired, I think, the image stabilization. But it's still quite functional and certainly much better than it has been in the past with previous lenses I've shot, like the 150 to 600 DSLR Sigma. So I think it's come a long way, but we're still seeing a little bit of a gap in the image stabilization capabilities of the Sigma 500mm and Sony A7R5 compared to some of the competition. And finally, I want to talk about just the combination, right, of the A7R5, which is a 61 megapixel camera, and this lens. The A7R5 autofocus is really, really, really great. And this lens is perfectly capable of utilizing that really amazing autofocus and the full 61 megapixel sensor. So I think this combination is awesome, right? Because you're getting a 500 millimeter 61 megapixel image, but you're also capable of cropping into that extensively because there's so much resolution, certainly to the DX crop, or to the APS-C crop, sorry, Nikon language, but you can, crop up to that 1.5x, and you can certainly go beyond that. And so that's giving you a lot of versatility in a very light and easy to carry package. You got the 500 when you want to be wider, and then you certainly have the ability to go to an effective focal length of 800 millimeters or beyond if you need it. Because of Sony's limitations, you cannot use teleconverters with this lens. On the other hand, I wouldn't use a teleconverter with this lens, particularly when paired with a 61 megapixel sensor. You don't need to because you can crop in so much. And by the point where you're cropping into like an effective focal length of 800 millimeters, you know, you're still getting like a, I don't know, 18 megapixel image, and you're far more likely to have issues around heat haze or other atmospheric, you know, aberrations than you are to have an issue with the resolution of the camera. So I don't think you need a teleconverter. I think that makes this a very compelling combination, particularly on the A7RV, where you can only shoot 10 frames per second anyway in compressed RAW, by the way. You know, if you do uncompressed RAW, it's going to drop to 7 frames per second. So, you know, you're not up against that limit that Sony's imposed on third-party lenses of 15 frames per second. So the combination is really attractive. A7R5, 500mm Sigma, it's what I would go if I wanted to shoot wildlife on Sony, if I couldn't afford the A1. I think the A1 and a huge GM Prime, very attractive, but I probably still want this lens. And for something like birds, where I'm going to be shooting at 500 or 600 millimeters minimum anyway, I'd take this over the 200 to 600 that's become kind of the mainstay, simply because of weight, because you're getting a lens that weighs 50% less than the 200 to 600 and is so easy to carry and such a joy to use in the field and so sharp. So I hope you enjoyed this review. I hope it's helpful for you, and leave a comment if you have questions. I'm going to have this lens for a little bit now, and I am happy to do more tests, more comparisons, give you my thoughts on various things from my experience. So take care, don't forget to get outside, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.